Welcome to today's episode. I'm delighted to be joined by Cormac Smith, who's worked in public relations and corporate communications for over 3 decades. In 2016, he travelled to Ukraine to take up a special appointment as the strategic communication advisor to Pavlo Klimkin, then the foreign minister of Ukraine. He was attached to the British embassy in Kyiv and was embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the first foreigner to hold such a position. While in Kyiv, he advised and provided training for 5 other government ministries. Also joining us is Philip Ingram, a journalist and consultant who's built on a long and senior military career as an intelligence, counterintelligence, security officer, and planner. Philip has extensive business experience, especially in steel manufacturing. He's also got extensive media experience appearing on the BBC, Sky News, and radio networks. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please do check you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the amazing guests that appear on the channel. And a huge thank you to everybody in the audience who sends messages, emails me, but also who has become a patron or done the buy me a coffee thing. It really does help to keep the channel going. Thank you also to everyone who has contributed to trying to get our documentary film made about Ukraine. Some who are regular viewers of the channel will have seen the various posts and adverts around that. We are kicking off the first part of the production of that documentary, and this side of the new year, we hope to have some really interesting material for everybody, but especially for those who have contributed to make it happen.
Jonathan, it's always a pleasure and an honor to join you.
This has been the most effective way of deterring the West from supporting Ukraine, from actually committing to a comprehensive victory. And this is the nuclear saber rattling. Are we likely to see this continue? Is it going to be as effective as it's been so far? Or is it a bit like crying wolf? Is the effect of the nuclear blackmail starting to wear off?
Well, I think the answer to that is a bit of each. Are we likely to see it tail off? No, I think we're likely to see it increase. I think Putin has recognized that there has been some success with this nuclear saber rattling in that at different times, and we have to remember 2024 has been a time of great political hiatus across the world, and that in itself has given opportunities for Putin to exploit his saber rattling. But as new governments or governments change and new governments settle in, he's still got an opportunity to try and influence things. The biggest areas he is influencing, I would suggest, is probably in the EU. And early 2025, we're going to have German elections. So again, he's got continual opportunities there to try and make domestic concerns impact support that countries are going to give Ukraine. And he's been very successful in achieving that throughout 2024.
Trump has a lot more levers that he can pull, a lot more cards that he can place. I mean, some of those, of course, are putting pressure on the Chinese economy, which could deflate the yuan. It could force China to relent in some of its support on Russia. It could put pressure on North Korea to not be so involved. But also there seem to be many loopholes that could be closed. Trump, for instance, could put pressure on the EU to hand over the 300 billion in Russian central bank assets. That wouldn't cost the US a penny, but it could help make Ukraine, resilient and go to market to buy the weapons which are so slow in being applied. That's just a few. I did an episode where we had the top 10 things Trump could do, and people have been sending more ideas through. There's lots he could do to force Putin into a negotiation which otherwise he would not contemplate.
Well, I said the day after Donald Trump won the election that there may well be a silver lining in Donald Trump's election for Ukraine. And what I was thinking of mainly was that might act as a wake-up call to Europe, for Europe to realize that, we finally needed to stand on our own 2 feet. So I think in relation of what you said, yes, there are a lot of levers that Donald Trump has at his disposal. He has never been more powerful in his business or his political life than he is now, as opposed to, I think I've already said, Vladimir Putin, who is probably at the weakest he has been probably since he ascended to the presidency of the Russian Federation. If if I was in a position to advise Donald Trump, I think the main thing that I would want to say to him is the extent to which all of this is linked up. The war in Ukraine is linked to China and China's ambitions against Taiwan. It is also fundamentally linked to what's happening in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza and Lebanon. One of my favorite soapboxes is the fact that we know that Russia played a very significant role in training, preparing, and arming Hamas ahead of the 7th of October 2023 attacks. But this seems to be something that very few people in the media need to talk about. And there's another area or another lever that Trump could use, and it's put pressure on Israel and Netanyahu, because Netanyahu, I said recently, has for too long tried to keep a foot in both camps, a foot in the Russian camp and a foot in the Western camp. And, Netanyahu needs to pick a side. And Netanyahu, let's remember, virtually did not lift a finger to support Ukraine back in 2022, despite Ukraine having a Jewish president with over 73% it was of the popular vote, and actually been the only country in history at one stage outside of Israel who had both a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister when Volodymyr Groysman was still in office back in 2019. So it always seemed very strange to me until friends of mine who are, expert in that part of the world, started explaining to me how there was the amount of Russian money and Russian oligarch support and influence that there was within the state of Israel. So I know I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think one of the pieces of the jigsaw that we need to put in place here is to see Israel finally pick a side and join up all the dots on this. And those dots, go back to the axis of evil, which I keep talking about, which is Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China. And, if I agree with Donald Trump on one area and one area alone, I think it has been that Europe and European members of NATO in particular have not always paid their fair share, and we have sought to rely on American support. So we saw during his last term when he threatened to take the United States out of NATO, and he made various threats. We have seen quite a reaction of a number of European states increasing the amount of money that they're paying. We need to pay an awful lot more. And if that negotiation or if that agreement with Donald Trump would be, look, don't leave us completely out in the cold. We still need your support, but actually we will do what we do. And one of those things would be certainly to expedite the release of this 300 billion in frozen Russian assets that's held in European banks. So this is a lever that Donald Trump certainly could use. So if I was advising Donald Trump, I would say, see that this is joined up. There are questions about how much pressure Russia may be able to put on Donald Trump, and if they, threats of possible assassination or the release of compromat which they may hold. Quite frankly, and it's only my assessment, I can never get inside Donald Trump's head. Donald Trump is so powerful and egotistical at the moment. I don't think that the threat of assassination holds any fear for him. I also don't think that the threat of any compromat, which the Russians may have, going back to as far as 2012 and involving sexual scandals or whatever it may be. And yes, people I've spoken to in both our security services and security services in Ukraine as back as 2016 were very, very clear in indicating to me that this compromat existed and the sort of horrible, sleazy nature that it probably contained. But I don't think I don't think Donald Trump can be too worried about that. This is the man who famously said, that he could shoot dead somebody on 8th Avenue in broad daylight and he could get away with it. Well, that was over 4 years ago, I believe. In fact, it was longer ago than that. It was in the run-up to his first presidency. And we have seen Donald Trump literally shrug off so many scandals and indictments and everything else. I mean, this guy, like it or not, is Teflon. So, yeah, my assessment would be that Donald Trump knows exactly how powerful he is. He knows exactly what levers he has at his fingertips. What I cannot assess is, what does Donald Trump really want, on the basis that all of us do everything for a reason? What does Donald Trump really want? That, to me, is the great unknown. But combined with the fact that this is a man who is notoriously unpredictable, I'm looking for the positives at the moment. But there is a certain amount that none of us, we simply don't know.
And the last bit is to loop back to that other point, which is the one thing that Russia has been effective at, and it's not necessarily on the battlefield at all. It's not in logistics. It's not in any of that sort of complex stuff, but it's been very effective at making nuclear threats, at using the psychology of a nuclear deterrence as actually an offensive weapon. And this continues. Do you see Western allies wising up to this? Is there a big difference, let's say, between London and Germany? Is Washington starting to lose its patience with these sort of endless threatening behaviors? And indeed, to ensure any kind of victory for Ukraine, do we have to get beyond, and cut through these threats, this reflexive control that the Kremlin is trying to exert over us?
Jonathan, we absolutely have to get beyond this reflexive control, and it's been very, very clear. I think I've mentioned already, but a good Ukrainian friend of mine, a senior diplomat, mentioned to me recently, I was visiting him, and he said that they had counted in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs over 125 times that Russia had rattled the nuclear saber in one way or the other. Now, I go back to very shortly after the full-scale invasion. I was invited to debate with Lord Richard Dannatt, the former head of the British Army. And I was invited to debate with Lord Dannatt on whether we in the West should put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which was something that the Ukrainians fought very, very hard for over a number of weeks, and then dropped the fight because the West simply was not going to do it. And I well remember in that live TV debate what Lord Dannatt said to me, and what clearly was his belief, was that the Russian nuclear threshold was far lower than was ours in the West. And in his words at the time, it was better that tens of thousands of Ukrainians died than hundreds of thousands of us. Now, that was Lord Dannatt's point of view. I believe it was a point of view shared by many, many more at the time. My assessment, listening to leaders and listening to, former senior diplomats and former senior military people, is that we have become less vulnerable in the West to that sort of rhetoric, and our leaders certainly seem to be aware that it is highly unlikely. And of course, we always have to caveat it with nobody really knows. But I think our leaders know that it is highly unlikely, if not certain, that Putin would never revert to strategic nuclear weapons against a Western city, which of course they have threatened only in recent weeks, or even a tactical nuclear weapon to be used on Ukrainian soil. Because I think we know, and it's never been made public, but I think we know that Russia has been told very, very clearly by Western allies not to use nuclear force. And if they do, that the asymmetric response, i.e., we would not respond with nukes, but we would respond with conventional means, would be so overwhelmingly destructive. as to make it not worth their while. The other factor is we believe that China and also India, who are very important partners of Russia, and both nuclear powers themselves, will have told Putin very, very clearly that this is something they would not countenance or support. So I think we need to wake up to the fact and stop being cowed by Russia's nuclear threats. A greater threat is not what our senior leaders and former diplomats like myself, or former military leaders, or former politicians know. The greater point is what the public fear. And what we do, the one thing we haven't mentioned yet, is the power and influence of Russian disinformation, which of course is and always has been a key component to their grey zone or hybrid warfare. And we have seen this evolve over the last 3 years of the full-scale invasion. I initially, back in January, February of 2022, sat down with a number of friends to identify. I want to identify what are the 5 top lies that are told. And those 5 top lies were Maidan was a US-backed coup, Ukraine was full of Nazis, Donbass was a civil war, there was genocide against the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine, and of course the big one, it was NATO expansion, which had caused and necessitated Russia's invasion in the first place. Now, we still hear useful idiots and people who are ill-informed, or people like maybe the leader of a particular a party in the UK, Nigel Farage of the Reform Party, come out very publicly and still hold to the lie of NATO expansion. But most people can see that lie for what it is. But the other myths, although we still hear them, don't seem to have the same currency that they've had before. And if we look at Russian disinformation, we have seen somewhat of a pivot, and we have seen huge resources gone into influencing certainly members of the far right and maybe the far left in our economies, talking about the common Russian narrative of the moral decline and the downfall of Western societies, and at the same time talking about Russia as some sort of an upholder of traditional Christian family values. So that's just one example, but we know that Russia is hugely active in the disinformation sphere. It was identified recently, I think, that up to 80% of all disinformation originates from the Kremlin. And I think we cannot underestimate the degree to which Russian disinformation is still affecting our citizens, and what our citizens believe in democracies is hugely important. And I have always said that Putin and his other allies in the axis of evil, they use our democracy and our democratic values against us. So, no, I think the majority of our leaders are now wise to the nuclear saber rattling. But, I still hear in radio phone-ins and various opinions and on social media, we still hear, useful idiots, I will call them again, talking about, they don't want to be nuked and Russia could nuke us and so forth. So I'm not, I still see this form of what you call reflexive control. I still see it as a battle that we have to win, and it's something that we need to do an awful lot more in our societies to educate our citizens, to make our citizens more resilient, and to enable our citizens to to recognize these myths and threats for exactly what we are. This brings my mind back very, very briefly to a discussion that you, I, and operator Starsky and another Ukrainian lady had about disinformation a few months ago, where at the end of it, I said, the most important thing, what I had learned from the countries, and I mentioned Sweden and Finland in particular, who were the most effective at combating and resisting Russian disinformation, was the resilience of our citizens, and starting at a very early age in school to give people the ability to be more discerning and to discriminate between what was true and what was false. So Russia is still, along with everything else, and we've had the dire warnings of a massive uptick in grey zone hybrid warfare, and we need not to forget that this grey zone warfare, much of it is being waged against us in the information space. And in that space, the nuclear saber rattling still makes many of our citizens very, very nervous.
We've also been talking about Trump actually having far more cards in his hand, far more levers he can pull to pressure Putin, not just to negotiate, which is something he's singularly not seemed to have been actually very keen to negotiate in good faith, going back over the last sort of almost 3 years. But at this point, could Putin perhaps be pushed into a negotiation, and indeed a negotiation stance that may make him appear domestically as weak, simply because Trump has so much power in his hands? But does he realize it, and will he leverage it?
Well, this is very interesting. The Trump-Putin relationship. Whenever Trump was president beforehand, he did not follow the norms, the diplomatic norms. Whenever he was meeting Vladimir Putin, for him to sit down and have a long meeting with Vladimir Putin one-on-one, with no officials present, no notes, no recording of what was said and what happened, was unprecedented. And it's interesting, as this campaign has got in, and after Donald Trump has become the president-elect, we've had the interesting point where Donald Trump, his team has said that he's phoned Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin has, and sorry, when he phoned Vladimir Putin, said, "Don't escalate the conflict inside Ukraine." Vladimir Putin's team has denied that phone call ever happened, but it was his disinformation mouthpiece, Peskov, who made that statement. And we've had a comment from Donald Trump's son to say that Donald Trump himself didn't try and speak to Putin. So what I think has happened is that Trump's team has tried to, or has spoken to Putin's team. Putin has, whenever the wording has been put out that it was him that was spoken to, Peskov has said, no, there's been no phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, which is strictly speaking accurate, but it's the two teams that have talked. However, what I thought was even more interesting was what the Russian reaction was to after that conversation between the two teams, and that was to put naked pictures of Melania Trump all over Russian television for a period of time. And thinking of things from an old Russian espionage perspective, that's Putin threatening Trump, 100%. I've got naked pictures of your wife. I'm willing to put them up publicly. You don't know what else compromat I've got on you. And therefore, that would only be in response to a threat that's come in from either Trump or Trump's team to Putin that Putin didn't like, and has unsettled him enormously. And then just after that, we get the ATACMS short-range ballistic missile authorization, the authorization for UK and France to deliver Scalp missiles to be used inside Russia, and those are cruise missiles. And then Russia's response is an intermediate range, a new type of intermediate range ballistic missile being fired into Ukraine. We've got escalation coming in both from the threatening perspective and from the weapons perspective, and it's all linked. So I don't think Putin liked what it was that Trump's team had said, and expected Trump to come in, as everyone was predicting, and be very pro-Putin, very anti-Ukraine, and almost force Zelensky into a peace agreement by threatening to withdraw US support. Zelensky, on the other hand, is playing a brilliant card. Zelensky has recognized what the threat was from Trump, and he's already gone before the election and come up with his road to victory plan, and has overtly said he's willing to look at. He's willing to sit and negotiate. He understands negotiations are needed. He wants to sit down and talk about the end of the war, and he has praised Donald Trump for being the president that is likely to make the war a lot shorter. So he's playing Trump quite nicely, whereas Putin is entrenching himself. What that's going to mean is as soon as Trump gets into power and is sworn in on the 20th of January 2025, he's going to be put in that position where, having said he's going to finish the conflict within 24 hours, he's going to have to go and try and bang the two sides together. Zelensky, I think, will continue with the language of cooperation and will have a language of concessions. He won't want to give any concessions, but he'll bring the language in, whereas Putin's language will be no, hard, firm, no concessions. In fact, I want more. And that will force Donald Trump's hand into, I think, providing greater freedoms for the Ukrainians, for Zelensky, and potentially giving the Ukrainians access to even more weapon systems to hurt Putin and try and force Putin into a position where he has to give concessions. Because at the end of the day, every conflict ends in negotiations. War is diplomacy by other means. However, what it's there to do is to set the conditions for that normal diplomacy to get back in again, whether those conditions are a total surrender of one side, as we saw in the Second World War, or a diplomatic withdrawal, even if you've won the tactical battle, which we saw in Vietnam. The Americans didn't lose a single tactical battle in Vietnam, but were forced to withdraw from the theater of operations, therefore lost the battle. So everyone is focused on who is winning in Ukraine, on what is happening on the tactical battlefield. That's not going to dictate where the outcome is. It's going to be at the operational, or more accurately, at the strategic level. And Putin is on the back foot, very much so there.
And of course, some of the levers that Trump can pull are not just military. In fact, he has far more economic levers to pull. Do you think, because part of his thing is to show up European countries, because some of them clearly are not meeting even their minimum NATO requirements. Poland is greatly exceeding it, as are the Baltic nations. The UK is hovering somewhere, slightly above the technical NATO commitments. He could, for instance, put huge pressure on Europe to hand over the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets, which would be a huge boon for the Ukrainian war effort. He could say that he's not going to give a single cent of American money towards Ukraine, but he could sell them weapons under some kind of lend-lease program. So there's some extraordinary things he could do, which perhaps are not nearly off the table.
Oh, there's a lot that he could do, and we have to remember that he approaches things from a businessman's perspective, not a politician's perspective. So he will be looking at those business deals, and it's not just Europe he's going to put pressure on. You look at his nearest neighbor, Canada. They do not spend anywhere near 2% of GDP yet are NATO members, and not only the NATO members, they're a member of the Five Eyes community. So Trump will put an awful lot of pressure on those nations that are not spending at least 2% of GDP, and I suspect he might pressurize it up to at least 3% of GDP, given the threats that there are around the world. His rationale for that, I think, is very sound. There are three conflicts around the world. We've got Europe with Russia, Ukraine. We've got the Middle East brewing up fast, and we've got Southeast Asia potentially brewing up fast. And the world wants the United States to solve all of them. Well, that's kind of unfair whenever you've got power blocks like the EU and European members of NATO who've got the sort of same buying power as the United States. It's time for them to step up. So from a business perspective, he's 100% right. What he's not going to do, I don't think, and again, thinking of things from a business perspective, is do anything to undermine the way US support is going into Ukraine, i.e., the amount of money that's being spent in US defense industrial based companies um, providing manufacturing output on defense related issues, because that is strengthening the United States. It's also something that Europe is stepping up to and realizing that its defense industrial base was not fit for purpose, and that is growing enormously. And Trump will want to see that continue. So he's not going to stop the money. It's just where he gets the money from going into that. Because in selfish United States terms, that growth in his defense industrial base, the $60 billion that was going to Ukraine, most of that $60 billion is actually spent in the United States. It's increasing manufacturing capacity, which is increasing the number of jobs in the manufacturing organizations supporting defense, which is increasing the number of jobs in supporting industries, whether it be logistics or whether it be service industries, and everything else, right down into local communities where there's more money going into real estate because people can afford to buy things, so more houses are being built, et cetera, et cetera. So if he stopped that amount of money going to support Ukraine, then that would have a detrimental effect on US employment and US business, and it would start to shrink again. With the growing instability across the world, defense industrial bases need to grow capacity so that they can meet potential requirements of the future. When that's there, the world will become a more stable place rather than a less stable place, because if other threat actors like China believe that they can out-manufacture the West in ammunition terms and other terms and exhaust the West's supplies, then there's a greater potential that they will go and carry out military actions themselves. So we live in interesting times. It's going to be very interesting to see how things pan out as Trump gets in. I think we have been too quick to put him in a doom and gloom box when it comes to the support for Ukraine and when it comes to Europe. And again, I think if we look at what happened last time, a large number of countries inside NATO who were not contributing at least 2% of their GDP got themselves up to there. There's still more to go. I do think the UK is in for a hard time though, because Trump will see the Labour Party in the UK as the Democrats, or Trump's team will. In simplistic terms, they'll translate that across into US speak. It's the Democrats, and they'll see Keir Starmer as Biden-Harris. And the noises that are coming out of the UK when it comes to the defence review that's happening, the cuts in platforms that have been announced prior to the defence review, and cuts in in-year money will not be going down well with the Trump team. Never mind the issues going on around the Chagos Islands and elsewhere. The UK could find itself in a position where it's going to become an object of bullying by Donald Trump very, very quickly indeed, because he'll want to try and bring the UK back on side.
And indeed, our participation in the ICC and an ambiguous answer as to whether Netanyahu could be arrested on UK soil. These are all
Yeah,
serious trigger points for Trump's team. Something you mentioned earlier, I think, is absolutely fascinating, because I want to put a separate episode out on this, because there's some very interesting KGB thug language that has come out in the last week. And this is both Patrushev and Putin giving, if you listen to the Russian original, they're definitely giving a very veiled and barely even veiled threat to Trump, telling him to watch out,
yeah,
steer clear of open windows. That, serious, I wouldn't even call it negotiating tactic. They're trying to rough him up. His reaction is not, Melania is one thing, but this is something else,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it won't go down well at all.
Well, yeah, we're seeing those, as you rightly say, not very veiled threats. Again, this is typical old Russian intelligence services. It's very interesting to see the open threats, and they are open threats that are coming from the Russians towards Donald Trump. This is a typical Russian intelligence, throw your toys out of the basket, or your dummy out of the pram side of things, where they're getting really, really angry, which suggests to me that Putin is really worried about what Trump is going to do. because the threats aren't veiled. If we combine that with the fact of an increase in grey zone activity that's going on with um, cables being cut in the Baltic, with firebombs being found in DHL parcels by DHL distribution points, by arms factories, the Deal factory in Berlin mysteriously catching fire, warehouses in the UK catching fire, spy rings being identified. We're seeing a massive uptake in um, Russian grey zone physical activity that's going on around the world. Um, that's trying to cause disruption and disruption happening at every level. But this next set of threats in against Donald Trump and his team are even a level above that. I don't think we've seen that in recent years. And therefore, that to me says that Putin is extremely concerned about what the future holds for him.
And the last area that we're going to discuss here, and this is, I mean, there seems to have been an interesting conversation perhaps between Biden and Trump, almost a tacit agreement that Biden is actually going to scale up provision of supply to Ukraine. And that makes actually easier for Trump because
Yeah.
if Biden's already done that, he doesn't have to do that in the first weeks when he comes in. So that's kind of interesting. And it makes his position to end the war actually easier if Ukraine's got a number of months supply under its belt. Some people, however, and to get your sort of defense and intelligence point of view on this would be interesting. Some people have said that Biden may have left this far too late. Even the funds that have approval and the additional new funds that he is requesting, even if he gets all of that sort of administratively agreed, physically and logistically, he may have left it too late to get that equipment actually sent to Ukraine prior to Trump actually taking office.
He probably has left it too late to get it there by the 20th of January. But provided all the decisions are made, the funding has been ticked that it can go. The logistics have been brought into the warehouses. The aircraft slots and the shipping slots have been booked and all the rest of it. It's like the train. He's loaded the train up, and even if he's just pushed it out of the station, it's going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to stop it. He would have to do something actively to stop it. So he can turn around and just ignore that. And I have to agree with you. I think Trump's team have sat down with Biden's team and asked them to sort of increase the amount of supplies that are in there. And I think it would not surprise me if it was Trump's team that put the pressure on Biden to remove the restrictions on the use of ATACMS inside Russia and to remove the ITAR restrictions on the UK and French Storm Shadow and Scalp cruise missiles being used inside Russia as well with US navigation systems on it, because that's a decision that Trump then doesn't have to make. And it gives him more of a negotiating position when it comes to dealing with both sides. So I don't think he's going to stop it. I think it started, and therefore that's a good thing. But no, it's not going to be there on time for the transition. But the promises are good. Ukraine needs it properly for as it's coming in to set the conditions for further offensives and stuff in spring. But again, it's that balance between achieving things from a tactical perspective and being able to influence operationally. The Kursk incursion and supporting that is an operational move by Ukraine, allowing them to wrestle the initiative back. Since they've done that, they've sort of stalled and they've lost that initiative at the sort of tactical operational level, but they're continuing to maintain that initiative at the operational strategic level with their attacks against oil refineries and impacts on Russian naval shipping and elsewhere, and the political pressure that's being put on Vladimir Putin. So we're in for an interesting time. We're not in for something finishing very quickly indeed, I don't believe.
And the evidence seems to be that Putin is minded to escalate before negotiate, which is
Yeah,
a classic Russian technique anyway. Grab as much as you
yeah,
can and then demand more when negotiations happen.
yeah.
So again, that suggests between now and January, we're going to see a considerable escalation in the threats, the grey zone, but also in Kursk, Donbass, and even Zaporizhia.
Putin's ambition to um, overwhelm the Ukrainians from a tactical perspective. He's doing that by forcing the Ukrainians in the front line to run out of ammunition. They're running out of ammunition because they're killing so many Russians. They're losing between 1,400 and 2,000 a day, dead or seriously wounded. That is unsustainable in resupply of manpower into the front line, which is why Putin is having to go to Africa to recruit, go to North Korea for troops and elsewhere. And it's unsustainable in supporting the casualties that are going back into the medical system, back into Russia. Putin is hurting really quite badly indeed. If the Ukrainians can just keep any advances with the Russians very slow, but start to influence as much as they can at the operational strategic level. And this is where General Budanov, the head of the GUR, the HUR in Ukraine, their military intelligence organization, is leading those particular operations. But Budanov, with all of his SOE type operations that are going on, that is having a massive effect, especially as we see increased political pressure coming from the rest of the world on the Russian investments overseas and the impact that that's having on the Russian economy. The ruble is at its lowest it's ever been, and the economy is on the brink of potential collapse. So we live in interesting times.
Well, Philip and Cormac, it's been a tremendous pleasure speaking. I think there are a lot of actually really interesting topics that come up and a different perspective on not only what Trump can do, but also his potential intentions there. I think there's a lot to talk about. We'll unpack that in subsequent episodes. For now, thank you both so much for joining me on the channel.
Thank you.